The Exorcist is famous almost exclusively for its scenes involving the demonically possessed 12-year-old girl character Reagan, but the film begins with a roughly 10-minute long mini-story set in Iraq. This mysterious and hypnotic prologue is, for the most part, consciously forgotten by the audience shortly after the story transitions to Georgetown, America. And we're only explicitly reminded of it when Father Merrin shows up toward the end of the movie to perform an exorcism. But even with that character connection, the events we witnessed in the Iraq opening scenes are never explained. The opening sequence also receives less discussion than the rest of the film for the simple fact that very little happens in the Iraq sequence that we can consciously latch onto in terms of overtly stated plot points. It's also less controversial due to its lack of shock horror moments. Obviously, Merrin is afraid of some unseen evil force that manifests itself symbolically as a winged serpentine statue. But aside from that, there's not much in the way of typical movie dramatics, and yet the scenes are somehow captivating anyway. In a recent rewatch, I felt compelled to stop and explore these scenes more carefully, and having now done that, I can confidently say that the Iraq sequence is my favourite part of the entire Exorcist movie. It avoids the majority of cinematic storytelling conventions in favour of a deeply subliminal communication style that works even better than standard movie storytelling conventions, or at least for me it does. There are only 12 lines of dialogue in the whole 10 minutes. Most of those lines are simple gestures consisting of only a couple of words, and all the dialogue is spoken in another language so that we have to rely on subtitle translations. This discarding of word explanations, combined with the almost complete absence of a standard musical score, forces the audience into the unusual position of relying on visuals and incidental sounds for information, which in turn makes the scene more aesthetically immersive at the base sensory level. I was also very pleased to find that throughout the rest of the movie there seemed to be many subliminal references to the Iraq sequence, ones that I'd never picked up on before. And I don't just mean the obvious stuff like Merrin himself. There are lots of other smaller references that collectively convey a sort of time and space spanning continuum of spiritual events. In addition to all this, the Iraq sequence can't be fully explained by simply reading the novel by William Peter Blatty, which the film is based on. Because in the novel, the Iraq prologue is just 4 pages long. So most of what happens in the Iraq scenes of the movie is an expansion, and it introduces lots of new metaphors. So I'm first going to take you through the Iraq scenes with a fine-tooth comb and highlight the many subtle details that give the sequence its hypnotic power. Then we're going to excavate later scenes and dig up elements that subconsciously link back to the Iraq prologue. Oh, and by the way, I am working from the director's cut of the film here, simply because there's a little bit more in it. Right, let's get started. A major change in the director's cut is the inclusion of an opening shot of the McNeil house, which pans down to the street and then dissolves to the soon-to-be desecrated church statue. I like that new sequence in itself, for reasons I'm not going to go into here, but I would have preferred that it be included at some point later in the film because it messes with the film's time switch. In this new director's cut, we start in Georgetown, then go back in time to Iraq, and then shift back to Georgetown. It breaks the flow a little bit in my opinion, but anyway, what's done is done and it's not a movie-ruining change. So we initially see a very minimalist set of just 3 opening titles in blood red. The first 2 each fade in and are accompanied by screechy orchestral strings. But the title of the film itself doesn't fade in. It cuts in alongside an instant audio cut from the orchestral strings to the sound of chanting heard in another language. I consider this very unusual switch from titles fading into a jump cut to be a sort of subliminal jump scare. A very minor one, of course. It's like an underhanded message that this is a film that is going to give you some unexpected shocks. The chanting language barrier is important too because it connotes spirituality but denies us a verbal understanding. Then the title fades out, leaving us with a moment of continued chanting over a black screen of spiritual darkness. Then we fade into a shot of the sun in Iraq. Now, a very unusual editing choice here is that although the titles were in colour, the sun shot is at first black and white, so that it kind of looks like the moon, and then the rich yellow of the sun and blood red of the sky bleeds in. For me, it seems to convey three things. First, an astronomical change if the moon appearance was intended. Note that the sun and moon are present on the Ouija board used by Reagan later. Second, the notion that the story is going to lead into the hot fires of hell. And third, the notion that blood is going to be spilled during the story, hence the emphasis on red. Our next shot is a view of some ancient architectural structure shimmering in the heat of a long zoom shot. It's never explained what this structure is, but the novel roughly explains which Iraq cities lie in which direction from this location, thus narrowing the location down as being somewhere in the region of the ancient city ruins of Hatra. And it turns out that the location structure we see here is in fact the temple worship complex at Hatra, so there's a spiritual location framing right off the bat. The exact origins of the Hatra city aren't precisely known, being that archaeological studies have identified a mixture of periodic influences, so it may well have been built gradually across several periods as different rulers occupied it. I've read some claims that the temple was for the worship of sun gods, including Shamash. Note that the scene began with a shot of the sun. Also in the shot, animals are being herded, which might well be significant, being that the next shot specifically shows us herded sheep being led through an archaeological dig, and camels led across the top of the hill in the same shot as well. That's a lot of animals in one shot. These herded animals aren't presented as threatening in any standard religious sense, as we'd expect if it was, say, goats or snakes. So, a figure runs about the dig, and he looks to me like a teenager a couple of years older than Reagan. He finds Merrin and gives him the news about important relics being found. The composition here has Merrin placed low, with the boy's feet firmly placed on either side of the camera, and the boy looking down on Merrin. It was probably just the most convenient angle, but it might also have been a deliberate suggestion of a sort of dominating or threatening presence from above toward Merrin. After all, the demon of the story does present itself to Merrin through the possession of other human beings, and, as we shall shortly find, there are lots more inferences of that nature. So Merrin, played by Max von Sydow, caked with so much convincing elderly man makeup that he looks like part of the ancient ruins, makes his way to view the newfound relic pieces. Importantly, it's he, not the other diggers, who uncovers the dirt-encrusted demon face carving. As verified by the novel, the green face is indeed a depiction of a demon named Pazuzu. Now, a smart little touch here is that as the Pazuzu relic is pulled out of the spiritually dark void, a gust of wind is heard, and dust is blown off the relic. Strong winds are a symbolic part of the movie because, according to the novel, Pazuzu is the personification of the southwest wind. Now, I'll give a little more info about Pazuzu before we move on, in case you're not familiar with the mythology. The Pazuzu character hasn't been made up for the movie. In ancient mythology, he was the king of the demons of the wind. There is a little bit of confusion in that the novel describes Pazuzu's dominion as sickness and disease. That makes sense in terms of the sickness we'll later see in Reagan, plus the statue being a serpentine green. But according to the Pazuzu mythology literature that I've read, it was actually Pazuzu's wife Lamashtu who inflicted diseases upon men, and that when Pazuzu came forth to pull Lamashtu away from the world of men, although he was an evil spirit, he was thus preventing disease. But that doesn't seem to be the interpretation that William Peter Blatty had when he wrote the novel. So, when Merrin pulls the Pazuzu face out of the hole, we have the gust of the wind, as I mentioned, which might be a hint of Pazuzu taking flight. But also, a fly lands on Merrin's hand. Considering the time the film was made, that's a real fly, not a CGI inclusion. But while it might be incidental, or the particular take may have been selected because of the fly, I was struck by two other parallels. First, if Pazuzu, according to the logic of the story, brings sickness and disease, then the presence of a fly is quite fitting, as we often associate flies with disease. And second, we hear the sound of buzzing insects as Merrin views the statue face. Now that's not an accident. It could be the sound of flies, bees or locusts. It's certainly insect-like. And it's also possible that the buzzing insect music represents the voice of Pazuzu, because Merrin is looking into the face of the carving as we hear it. So, subtle suggestions of Pazuzu perhaps being spiritually released by the unearthing of this little carving. However, if the common interpretation that Merrin had already fought and defeated Pazuzu once before in Africa was true, then it makes no sense that the demon would have been trapped in the earth for centuries, only to be released by the digging up of this particular amulet. So the best sense I can make of it is that Merrin finding the amulet merely serves as a reminder of Pazuzu. It could even be that Pazuzu wanted this particular amulet to be found by Merrin as a call to the desired exorcism rematch. By the way, I've read some online claims that Pazuzu is not the demon who Merrin fights, and that it's just a catalyst archaeological find that triggers Merrin into realising that he's going to have to, again, fight an entirely different demon that he had previously fought in Africa. It is made clear later in the film that the demon specifically wants to combat Merrin via its possession of Regan. It starts asking Father Karras for an exorcism, and can be heard whispering Merrin's name as he receives a telegram calling on him to perform the exorcism. And then it screams his name as soon as he enters the house.
It's an honor to meet you, Father.
However, for me, the theory that the demon is not Pazuzu is blown out the water by a simple and unmistakable clue that anybody can notice. During the exorcism, the priests see a vision of Regan stretching her arms out with the Pazuzu statue right next to her, both of them backlit, and Regan's howl accompanied by a serpent-like howl from the statue. If Pazuzu was not the invading spirit, then the filmmakers wouldn't be pushing this parallel so strongly. Furthering this, on page 219 of the novel, Father Karras comes across an image of Pazuzu in an old textbook while he's researching the church's policies on exorcism. That's another definite association between Pazuzu and possession. Again, why make that connection if Pazuzu is not the invading demon in the story? So with that out the way, let's get back to the excavation. We cut from Merrin finding the Pazuzu pendant to a very brief shot of the yellow sun against a blood-red sky. This is the second time we've seen one of these, and this time a silhouetted portion of the ancient city. Now I'm very confident that this shot is symbolic because for the sun to dip this low on the Iraq skyline would require the time to be either dusk or dawn, but the scene continues on and the sun is high up in the sky again, indicating midday. Also in this sunshot there's a tiny little detail that might be included for meaningful intention. Something flies above the city or is blown across by the wind, and its appearance and disappearance at the edges of the frame very closely match the duration of the shot. It's like the shot was edited specifically to include this flying object. Of course, if it's a bird, then such a thing wouldn't be able to be arranged during the shoot, in which case I would say during the edit it would probably have been noticed and a decision made to include it specifically, a happy accident so to speak. And why would they do this? Well, maybe as a representation of Pazuzu in the air. We cut from this to shots of a cafe inside the city ruins, and immediately there's a prop that must be a Pazuzu related reference. The guy pouring the drinks is doing so through a weird spout that has a sculpture of a hybrid animal. I can see a fish body, bird wings, and what I think is a pig's head. Now that's important because in ancient mythology Pazuzu was said to be a hybrid creature made of different animal parts, and how strange that people are being poured their drinks through the mouth of this mythological creature carving. Is this some sort of indication of Pazuzu beginning to infect people in some way akin to possession? In addition, we can hear strange rhythmic metallic clanging that is later revealed to be the sound of metal forgers hard at work. This sound I consider to be a representation of Pazuzu preparing for war, like a drum roll or war cry meant for Merrin's ears. So next, a guy brings a drink to Merrin. Funny that a fair bit of screen time is given to this fella merely walking among the tables. Maybe it was so that the tapestry prop in the background could be included, as it looks like a representation of some ancient rulers of the city. The guy stares at Merrin too, probably just noticing that he looks like he's seen a ghost, but he's not the only one who seems to be staring. As Merrin drinks with a trembling hand, we strangely cut to two guys sat nearby, doing nothing except looking. Are they looking at him? And if so, why? When we cut back to Merrin, he's staring into some other realm, and the guy who was giving out the drinks through the weird hybrid animal spout passes between Merrin and the camera. It seems like nothing, but it's something that only tends to happen when filming if it's arranged to be that way. And Merrin's eyes respond to his unexpected presence. It's so subtle, and if nothing else, helps convey his paranoia. Then we cut to something else that seems almost random. A blind guy is being led somewhere by another man, and for some reason his mouth is covered by a sash. Like he's maybe blind and gagged, perhaps a little bit like cattle to the slaughter. It's such a weird thing to cut to, and it has no overt connection to anything. If it's symbolic, then who does the blind guy represent? Merrin and his feeling of helplessness? And who does the guy doing the leading represent? Pazuzu? I've no idea, but it seems too random a thing to include. So we cut back to Merrin from a different angle. Now pay attention here to the people passing in the background. A young boy, maybe a year or two older than Reagan, as was the case with the boy in the excavation scene, walks past holding up an image of what looks like an ancient god or some other person of importance. He's holding it specifically at an angle for the camera to see. The figure is coloured bright red, as the devil and demons sometimes are. So is this picture a subliminal hint of evil's presence? Note that later in the story, Reagan herself will be producing drawings and sculptures along these lines. And all the while throughout this cafe scene, the drum-like procession of metal forging clangs continues on. The scene ends with the guy asking if Merrin wants anything else, and Merrin says no. Again, the guy seems to be giving Merrin a penetrating stare, a little bit like the two guys who were sat nearby. Now we cut to a view of the hot fires of the metal forge, the fires of hell so to speak. An instrument or weapon or something is being forged by three guys, and now we can see what the source of the unnerving metal clanging was all along. We only see one of the three guys' faces up close, and he's gritting his teeth with determination. Merrin for some reason stops to watch the forging, which again seems like a really random thing to show, and the teeth-gritting guy stops and stares right at Merrin. I assume his milky blind eye is caused by a stray chip of metal from some past metal forging accident, but it undoubtedly makes him a little bit creepy, like he has a distorted demonic side or an evil eye. I've no idea if this person is an actor who's had a cataract imitation contact lens fitted, or a person at the tourist ruins location who really was blind in one eye. I could just imagine William Friedkin saying, "Let's get him into the movie." Oh, and note again the motif of blindness, which was present in the cafe scene as well. Merrin's response to this fella's stare seems to be a moment of increased exhaustion or hypnotised despair, perhaps at the knowledge of immortal Pazuzu fiercely preparing for a second battle. From here we cut to a clock and swinging pendulum, like a countdown to the inevitable confrontation with Pazuzu. The pendulum itself is a world-distorting convex mirror, time distortion being a factor in the story. Then we cut to the clock display, 12:05. So yes, the sun on the horizon shot wasn't possible unless night time has passed since the excavation, but we were given no such indications. Typically such a transition between night and day in movies is established by a dissolve between night and day shots. We cut from the clock to assorted faces etched into ancient stone like spirits watching. Merrin then picks up a little necklace pendant with some Latin writing on it, and it translates as "Saint Joseph, pray for us," or at least that's the translation I was able to come up with. So Merrin puts down the Saint Joseph pendant, and he picks up the now cleaned Pazuzu pendant, and the curator says, evil against evil. That doesn't make a lot of sense, but the novel explains it a little bit further. The owner had worn it as a shield. The general literature on Pazuzu mythology further explains that it was believed that Pazuzu's terrifying face could be used to frighten away other, lesser demons, hence evil against evil. So then the clock stops, suggesting Pazuzu interfering in the physical world. Time's up, Merrin, you're going to face your demon and possibly die. A couple of dialogue lines where Merrin says he has to leave and do something, which I can't think of any explanation for other than to go and wait to be called on to fight Pazuzu in whatever form he eventually manifests. On Merrin's way out of the city, a very weird sequence of shots shows a row of men bow down, apparently in prayer or worship, and their timing coincides very precisely with Merrin walking past behind them. Now I figure there's two possible interpretations here. It's already been established in the curator scene that Merrin is respected and depended on, and the novel pushes that point further. So maybe these guys are showing some sort of idolization of Merrin as he leaves, but if that was the intention, why not have them bow toward him? Instead, I think this is an insult from Pazuzu. The men are displaying their backsides directly in Merrin's direction. After all, vulgarity or obscenity is a key psychological weapon used by Pazuzu when he possesses Reagan, and it's common in devil depictions generally. And there's an additional figure dressed in black and white, sat in the shadows in front of the men bowing. Are they bowing to this shadowy figure? Who is he? Some prince of darkness or demonic entity in human form? There are little allusions later in the film and in the novel about secret witchcraft cults among us, so maybe this is some variation on that. Now Merrin passes through a corridor of people who seem to be constructing things, like a variation on the metal forging. It's a dark place and Merrin seems to be ignoring everyone. Little bars of light shine down on Merrin intermittently, like beacons of hope from the Lord. The general soundscape and claustrophobic visuals here seem like a depiction of his ongoing torment and challenges, like he's walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Now we cut to another sort of claustrophobic valley of sorts, imposing high walls as Merrin walks a narrow street. Several curious details here. A door slightly ajar and darkness within, with a guy sat just outside the door, looking at nothing apparently. A black-robed figure walks past Merrin, whose face we can't see. Silhouetted kids play fighting and shouting in the shadows of a tunnel behind Merrin. Then we cut to another black-robed figure stood at the top of the wall and looking down at Merrin. So it seems that, like with the cafe scene, Merrin is being watched by demonic forces, or another interpretation is that this is all a depiction of his paranoia. Maybe his fear that Pazuzu might show up and attack him in any possessed human form, so he feels like he can trust no one. Note that after the person on top of the wall sees Merrin, and I can't tell if this is a man or a woman, the figure slightly moves, as if responding to his presence specifically. Then we cut to Merrin again, this time passing around two more dark-robed mysterious figures, and he doesn't even glance at their faces. A lot of black-robed figures here, shadowy, dangerous entities. And the danger ahead is confirmed as Merrin is startled by nearly being knocked down by black horses pulling a black carriage, and in the carriage, another black-robed figure. This time we can see the face, and what a weird face it is. I don't know what emotion I'm supposed to read from that creepy face, but it wouldn't look out of place in the hospital full of crazy people where Karras visits his mother later on. Given Merrin's heart condition, which is what I assume the pills were for, I'm surprised he didn't have a heart attack and die right here. So Merrin now goes back to the temple ruins of Hatya. In the novel, the location changes so that he travels to another ancient temple site called Nineveh, which is north of Hatya. In a continuity error that virtually nobody would detect in the audience, this priest says that Merrin was digging at Nineveh, not Hatya. But I guess for the movie they decided to film all the Iraq stuff in one location, and why not? The second location wasn't really needed. The first camera angle is sort of a sneaky prowling view from a distant alcove, a bit like when Merrin was watched in the streets. Guards come running out as if wanting to shoot him. Why so jumpy? And I like the cracked glass of the windshield. Made me wonder if someone had accidentally took a pot shot at Merrin before. He's also very briefly seen with his head behind the cracked glass. That might be coincidental, but cracked glass and cracked mirrors are sometimes used in movies to convey a character at breaking point or already being psychologically messed up. In the novel it states the guards cheerfully wave when they realise who it is, but here in the movie they seem indifferent. Let's not forget that the director and writer had slightly different ideas about the story. So Merrin is now walking as we view him from behind passing columns. Again, camera work kinda like he's being watched. This gets done often in horror movies, but here it's quite subtle, if that's the intention. Note the ongoing silence too. No wind, no music, not even much in the way of footsteps. It makes this location seem timeless and otherworldly, spiritual. So Merrin is walking around some high rubble, likely representing the higher spiritual plane where he'll eventually fight his demon enemy. The silence and stillness is suddenly broken by a strong wind. Remember that Pazuzu is king of the demons of the wind, and supposedly he represents the south wind. So this wind likely heralds his presence. A shadow moves over Merrin's face, but he's standing still, so something has physically moved. We cut to the shadow caster and it's a silhouette of an obviously demonic figure blocking out the sun. In other words, a bringer of darkness. And of course the sun represents God himself in certain religions, including the Shamash god who was supposedly worshipped at this temple. Again, sunlight is being used thematically because when he arrived in his jeep the shadows revealed it was midday, and yet now the sun is low in the sky. So he walks around the statue to face it in the opposite direction of its shadow. And we can see that the supposed demon is just a statue of a demon, yet the moving shadow over his face suggested that the statue actually moved, maybe even flew and landed in position. There's even a sound reminiscent of wings flapping, but I think it's just Merrin's hat creasing. We can also see the strange physical structure of the demon, and it seems to follow the literature on Pazuzu. Dragon, lion or dog face, a man's torso but with scales, bird's wings and eagle talons, and a snake for a penis. On that last point, Pazuzu has the sexual vulgarity aspect that is so prominent in Reagan's behaviour. The structure on which the statue stands further emphasises that the statue probably wasn't there before Merrin saw it. It's very unlikely that all the surrounding structure would crumble away in this manner and leave the statue itself in such good condition. Nah, the statue isn't literal. It's Pazuzu in symbolic form, and it's a great way of depicting him without corny special effects. By the way, that pose the statue is in is also found in actual relic depictions of the Pazuzu demon, and is somewhat similar to the famous Baphomet pose. Interesting how things seem to get handed down and adapted over the centuries from one religion to the next. After facing this statue, Merrin hears a noise and he turns to see a totally random guy just staring at him from in a shaded rock place. Again, this seems like thematic lighting because if this is what Merrin sees, then he ought to be in shadow too. His staring onlooker looks like he might be one of the assorted people who had been watching him in the cafe. Or maybe even the guy who was getting bowed down to here, the guy sat in the shadows. And he has his hands hooked on his belt, which is something people tend to do when they're ready to take an action of some kind, such as being ready for battle. So we've got that thing again of Merrin being constantly watched and threatened by people who might be doing Pazuzu's work. And to finish off the whole 10-minute sequence, we get the most obvious metaphors so far. Black and white dogs fighting, probably symbolising good and evil. The growls of the dogs become the symbolic voice of Pazuzu preparing to attack. After all, he has a dog-like head. Then a two-shot of a spiritual face-off with the wind blowing fierce, as is to be expected from the king of the demons of the wind, and fade to a final shot of the sun as a giant yellow orb against a red sky. This is the third use of such a shot so far in the whole Iraq sequence. Then a slow dissolve to Georgetown so that we get the visual blending of the two times and locations. And if you're really paying attention, you'll notice that the sound of an airplane is heard coming and going. This might represent Merrin's journey back to the United States, or even the journey of Pazuzu to Reagan's house, being that the shot zooms into the house. Right, so that wraps up the close examination of the opening sequences. And wow, even if only half the things I've drawn your attention to were intended by the filmmakers, it's still a damned impressive sequence. Very unusual. I particularly like the fact that when people watch the movie for the first time, they go in with expectations based on all the media hype about sexual vulgarity, spinning heads and vomit, but in the opening scenes, audiences are presented with an unexpected level of subtlety and an avoidance of cliched dramatics. So any preconceptions that the film is just a dumbed-down horror flick are scattered to the winds in the first 10 minutes. And the sequence does something that is now considered virtually no-go in most modern filmmaking. It relaxes and hypnotizes the audience, settling them in psychologically for the Georgetown possession story that will follow. Today, many filmmakers are desperate to get the audience pumped with dramatic adrenaline with an explosive opening scene, as if they're scared the audience will get up and walk out of the cinema if they don't get an instant high. We're not all drug addicts, you know. Okay, I said earlier I was going to take you through some of the ways that the rest of the film subtly references back to the Iraq scenes. I already mentioned the obvious vision of the Pazuzu statue next to Reagan, but there are many others to consider. A lot of them are animal related, particularly Reagan's drawings and sculptures, which I think furthers the link that it is actually Pazuzu possessing Reagan. Remember, Pazuzu is structured from the body parts of different animals. The really obvious one is the orange bird thing with big feet, like a kid's variation on the Pazuzu statue. On the wall in her craft play area are images of Little Red Riding Hood talking to the big bad wolf, disguised in grandmother's clothes, and Hansel and Gretel talking to the witch in the doorway of her house made of candy. Both of these fairy tales are references to hidden evil, and the wolf disguised as grandmother has a symbolic crossover with the double identity of spiritual possession. Virtually everything else she draws is animals, including birds, dogs, horses, butterflies, giraffes, rabbits, elephants, dinosaurs, and plenty of owls, a predatory bird of the night. And probably by coincidence, but who knows, Reagan and the witch are both dressed in pretty much the same tone of blue. I mean, Reagan ends up sort of looking kinda like a witch later anyway. And in this street shot, children run around in Halloween gear with some of them dressed as witches. Kids as witches. I wonder if the use of long hooked noses and chins on children's fairy tale witches are generally a sort of inference regarding the mouth and beak of a predatory bird. I mean, witches are often depicted as flying on broomsticks. The drawings that Karis looks at include bats in a tree with eyes looking out from a dark hole, maybe an owl. There could be a parallel there with Merrin's finding of a Pazuzu pendant in a dark hole, and she's drawn a winged lion, a combination of animal parts as is the case with Pazuzu. Lieutenant Kinderman looks at animal drawings by Reagan that include a lion, and her sculptures include a tiger that looks like it's ready to pounce. And there's another bird there, this time in black. The clay colours used are appropriate to each animal, and the clay object that Kinderman finds at the bottom of the steps looks to me like a two-legged upright walking dinosaur, sculpted in green. Pazuzu is also depicted as having lizard scales on his human-shaped body, and the sculpture is a similar dark green to the Pazuzu statue. I know it doesn't look incredibly green in the film because of all the grime and stuff, but in the novel it is specifically described as being a green pendant. Remember also that there were two-legged dinosaur images among Reagan's drawings in the basement. So I think Reagan planted this sculpture at the bottom of the steps, I did read a theory that it fell from Reagan's window when Burke was thrown, but it seems unlikely that it would make it all the way down and bury itself deep under the grass and retain its shape. Nah, it's been placed there. Pazuzu's made a calling card. And something that's quite creepy about this is that Reagan either placed it there in advance knowing that she was going to kill Burke Dennings, or after killing him she snuck out the house, placed it there near his dead body and then snuck back to bed. That's pretty damn creepy, isn't it? More animal references are found in Reagan's bedroom. Fish and butterflies. And little pictures of people on horses. In the same scene where Kinderman looks at the clay animals, we find more animals in this shot. A hen, what I think is a frog, and two big golden lions, not unlike what Reagan drew. They're just missing the wings, and one is sort of peeking out from behind a plant. And there are winged angel figures in a picture above them. I don't know if that's intended, but we've got the wings and the lions in the same shot here, very close to each other the props are. Chris is knitting an image of a giraffe as she waits in hospital. What a weird thing to include. And she's seen continuing with this same knitting project as Merrin prepares the exorcism. So that's not just an incidental prop, it's been used in two scenes that fall quite far apart in the movie's timeline. There are little clay animals on the doctor's desk in the hospital too, including a camel. Middle East reference there. Remember that we did see camels in the excavation. Note also that these sculptures are next to a photo of a child, no doubt the doctor's child. So the kid was likely the artist. Now isn't that a really specific thing to put in considering the emphasis that is given to Reagan's little animal sculptures in other scenes? More animal references include the spider walk and the alternate version of the spider walk where Reagan makes snake-like gestures with her tongue as she crawls toward terrified Sharon. Remember that Pazuzu was supposed to have a snake for a penis. Reagan growls like a lion in the hypnosis scene. And she moves like a cow here. Her mother seems to have a thing for elephants. I count 3 of them on her desk. And what looks like some winged human figures here. And there are these animal-headed figures painted on the lamp base. How many people have those kinds of images on their house furnishings? If I'm not mistaken, there's a mermaid in this picture. That's another hybrid animal like Pazuzu himself. There are black bird statues above the fireplace and what might be a little black cat ornament on the table. Black cats are generally a sign of bad luck, by the way. So many animal references in the film, and I wonder how many of these were deliberately placed to imply the pervasive, unseen presence of Pazuzu. The ones in the doctor's office particularly intrigue me because his daughter isn't supposed to be possessed. So does Reagan represent a generation of kids possessed or something along those lines? Maybe. There are some other things I'll mention shortly that allude in that direction. Moving on from the animal references that tie back to the Iraq scenes, there are some odd things going on with eyes too. In 2 scenes Reagan rolls her eyes right back into her head so that they're pure white. They must have used some sort of contact lenses for this. And I wonder if that's somehow related to the metal forger in Iraq having a milky eye. In at least 2 scenes, Chris is wearing a gold Hamza pendant, which is the hand of God with an eye in it. That symbol references right back to the Middle East and is used for spiritual protection just as the Pazuzu amulet was worn for protection by its wearer. The choice of green contact lenses for many of Reagan's scenes is something I'm curious about too. As well as making her look sort of like a cat, I wonder if it relates to Pazuzu being a sort of bringer of sickness and disease. That isn't the case in Pazuzu literature generally, but the novel does describe his dominion as sickness and disease. Same goes for the bright green vomit. For me, this was one of the worst creative choices in the film because it looks silly. It's too green. Red or brown would have been much more effective and disturbing in my opinion, like in the spiderwalk sequence. Imagine how much more shocking the vomit in the face scene would have been if the vomit had been red. Or even just yellow. But green is a colour we sometimes associate with sickness and disease, so unless it was just a bad creative choice, that might be why it was chosen. Here's some other bits and pieces. I'm not sure about all of them, but here goes, I'll just let you consider them. When Regan gets a brain scan, she is tormented by the experience as we hear the relentless thud of the machine. That strikes me as similar to the metal forging noises that tormented Merrin in Iraq. Merrin nearly being struck by a horse and carriage also reminded me of the roaring train unexpectedly coming at the camera as the introductory shot of Karras' subway scene. Especially being that the homeless guy who speaks to Karras is creepily shown in rapid strips of light from the train carriages, and his dialogue is later spoken by Pazuzu.
Father, could you help an old altar boy? Can you help an old altar boy, Father? Your mother's in here with his cars.
So maybe Karras was being targeted or summoned to battle as well as Merrin. That connection is also present in that Karras is wearing the same kind of St. Joseph pendant that was placed on the curator's table with the Pazuzu pendant in Iraq. It might even be the very same one. Through Regan, Pazuzu has to pull that pendant off of Karras' neck before it can possess him. I've heard the claim as well that Regan having her hand held up in the hypnosis scene basically is a mimicking of Pazuzu's usual stance, right arm raised. However, the raising of the subject's arm is sometimes used as a physical and psychological leverage technique in hypnotic induction, so I've got my doubts about that one. It still could be true though. So what else? Well, I mentioned earlier that Pazuzu is a god of the winds, and strong winds are used at several points in Georgetown. The chaos here in Regan's bedroom has the curtains flapping like crazy, blown about by a magical wind, and the notion of magical wind is actually suggested by Kinderman.
Watch out for drafts. A draft in the fall when the house is hot is a magic carpet for bacteria.
But a much more subtle use of the wind is when Chris is walking home after her film shoot. The wind gradually picks up as she sees kids in Halloween costumes, followed by nuns, the conflicting forces of good and evil present during her journey. Some other interesting stuff here too. We pan down specifically from the trees beginning to sway in the wind to a motorbike pulling up far behind Chris, and the subliminal growl of its engine can be heard. I wonder if that motorbike was deliberately arranged to be in the shot. Certainly the sound effect was added. Then we hear very clearly a portion of dialogue between Karras and another priest.
There's not a day in my life that I don't feel like a fraud. I mean, priests, doctor, lawyers, I've talked to them all.
I'm not sure which of the two men's dialogue we're supposed to be hearing, but it doesn't match them. One person's voice is heard, yet both of them are seen speaking. But what's even stranger here is that the engines of an airplane are heard very loudly over the shot.
Doctor, lawyers, I've talked to them all. I don't know anyone who lets himself that.
Remember that we heard an airplane as the story shifted from Iraq to Georgetown, and with no contextual justification given? Well, this time it's even more out of context. We could just assume it was to drown out the voices of the priests so that Chris couldn't hear anything more that they said, but that could have been achieved through a more realistically expected incidental noise, like police or fire engine sirens, or even the noise of the wind. So again, is the sound of plane engines being used to indicate something more spiritual, like the impending threat of Pazuzu flying about like the wind? A last couple of things about the Iraq to Georgetown transition. Both locations began with distant views of building structures. The temple site has big arches, as does the bridge here. Those arches might not be an intended parallel, but the featuring of a bridge I do believe is symbolic, a connection between two distinctly separate destinations, Iraq and Georgetown. The enlarged glowing sun of Iraq doesn't occur again in the movie that I can remember, but in the location transition it does seem to be mimicked by the large round bulb of Chris's bedside lamp. I don't know why, but that parallel just seems to be there. And here's another subtle parallel. We hear spiritual chanting as we see the temple structure in Iraq. And in the establishing shot of Chris's film shoot scene, we get a wide view that initially emphasises the building without showing any of the crowds of onlookers. That's an unusual way to introduce a crowd scene. But we do hear someone shouting on a megaphone, which struck me as similar to the religious chanting heard over the Iraq temple view. You might think that's really reaching, but listen to what the voice says.
In the group over here, I need a priest, a nun, and 2 students. That's what we want. That's exactly what we want.
Now, doesn't that sound very much like a parallel with the call out for priests to perform an exorcism, which will come later? And then we get a giant floodlight switched on, which is actually being used in the scene that is filmed as imitation sunlight. So again, that spiritual globe of the sun thing, a possible link. By the way, I think the reason for emphasising the university location building is because the church that gets desecrated later is called Dahlgren Chapel, and it's part of the very same university campus. So the call out for a priest and a nun is even more fitting with that context. And just rounding off this video now, I mentioned that kids play fighting was seen and heard in this street scene in Iraq. Well, this pops up again in some Georgetown scenes. Reagan and her mother wrestling here, 2 kids play fighting in the hospital waiting room, and kids messing around on a trashed car in the slum where Karras visits his mother. None of these instances of kids playing were necessary at the basic plot level, so why hire the extras and arrange them into the scenes? I'm sure it means something. The ages of the kids being similar to Reagan seems relevant in itself, so again maybe it's part of a general theme about youth being corrupted by forces of evil at large. And let's not forget the kids' Halloween costumes with regard to that. Kids infected with evil. Right, I'm going to finish off there. There might be many more cross-references between the Iraq and Georgetown locations, being that I've not done a complete search through the movie for them. So next time you watch The Exorcist, you might pick up on some more. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope I've given you some further appreciation for the deeply buried symbols and complexity of The Exorcist. The stuff that is usually missed while people are busy watching, talking and thinking about the more attention-grabbing dramatics of possessed Reagan's off-the-rails behaviour. Want more? CreativeLearning.com